Hello, this course has not been hijacked by another instructor. It is me. I know I look very odd to myself right now, so I must look even stranger to you. But for better or worse, the deed has been done. So if you need to take a breath, pause it, sort of let your eyes adjust, that's fine. But I promise it is me. So this is the second video on Beowulf. And hopefully by now you've looked at your essay question for the week. And the essay question, in so many words, asks, what does the hero, the epic hero Beowulf himself, tell us about Anglo-Saxon values and ideals? What Anglo-Saxon values and ideals does the character Beowulf embody? And you'll note that I throw in an adjective here. I say pre-Christian. What are the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon ideals and values that Beowulf represents? Why did I throw that term in there, pre-Christian? Well, as we'll see today in this video, Beowulf causes there's some interpretive difficulty that comes with interpreting Beowulf because of both the chronological and the cultural distance between the poet himself and the characters he's writing about, including Beowulf. He's separated by probably several centuries, separated by an ocean. There's no question that in many ways the Beowulf poet admires characters like Beowulf and Hrothgar and Wiglaf. On the other hand, and this is something I'm going to explore in this video, the poet is also aware that in some ways he has to part ways with his ancestors and that he cannot fully live out their values. Now, the most fundamental cultural difference between the Beowulf poet himself and the characters he's writing about is that the poet is himself Christian and the story is not, and the characters who inhabit the story are not Christian. Now, in the essay, what I want you to focus on is not so much the poet's own perspective and values, but the values and ideals embodied by the characters themselves, specifically the character Beowulf. Some of those values and ideals are shared by the poet, some are not. Doesn't make a difference. You're focusing on the values and ideals of the character Beowulf, who, for better or worse, represents pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon values and ideals. But it is one of the most interesting things about this poem. One of the most interesting features of the poem is that you have this tension between, I won't say conflict necessarily, but a tension at least, between the values of the poet himself and the values of the characters living in the world of the poem. And that's really what this video is going to be about. So I really am leaving you on your own to figure out what are those values and ideals that Beowulf embodies. But I hope what I've said clarifies a little bit what I'm looking for. We need to explore a little bit more of this really fundamental difference between the poet and the character Beowulf, and indeed all the characters in Beowulf. The question of religion. And here we need to talk about the historical background. The Anglo-Saxons start arriving in what is now called England around 450 or so. And when they arrive on English shores, they are pretty much to a one pagan. They are polytheistic, they have sacrificial rituals, and so on. But starting in the 7th century, so once the Anglo-Saxons have sort of put down roots in what is now England, some pretty vigorous missionary activity begins, Christian missionary activity. And so by the time that the Beowulf poet is writing his poem, we don't know exactly when that is, but let's say 8th, 9th century, maybe even 10th, many, if not most, of the English are Christian. But again, in the setting of the poem, everyone is pagan. Now, I've talked about the poet being a Christian, and your question ought to be, well, what's the evidence for that? Where do we see that? The poet never tells us that in so many words, so how is that a valid inference? I think there's a couple things to pay attention to here. For one, there's lots of what we might call monotheistic editorializing going on in this poem. So the poet takes pains at several points to make it clear that he, the narrator of the poem, is in fact a monotheist, not a pagan polytheist. So lots of references to the Lord, the Almighty God, and so on. And this even kind of bleeds into the characters themselves sometimes. Hrothgar or Beowulf will talk about the Lord or the Almighty. Now, that's not really historically accurate. These characters would have been polytheist. And I think the poet is quite clear that they're not Christian. But perhaps what the poet is trying to do is say, look, these guys represent what is most noble in this culture. And maybe in some dim, hazy sense, these characters had this kind of intuition that there really is this one supreme God above all. So I think maybe that's what's going on there. Another piece of evidence for the poet's Christian persuasion. There are a number of very clear Old Testament references in the poem. There's references to Cain, references to a flood. The creation story of Genesis 1 is sort of paraphrased by a singer very early in the poem. So I think that's beyond dispute. Now, what might seem a little bit odd is that there are no clear references to the New Testament. So what's up with that? Well, I think there are actually, to me, pretty compelling allusions, indirect references to the New Testament in the poem. When you come to the scene where Beowulf dives into the mere, dives into the lake, it's kind of a death and resurrection scene. Everybody thinks that Beowulf is dead, but some of his loyal followers stick around, and then lo and behold, he pops back up out of the lake. Very redolent of the stories in the Gospels about Jesus' death, the dejection of the apostles, and then the resurrection. Then later in the book, Beowulf is going to have his final contest, the contest against the dragon, and he initially at least sets out with 12 thanes to fight with him. All of them but one basically wimp out, and this is again highly reminiscent of the 12 apostles and the fact that most of them either fall asleep or they deny Christ or whatever. Although in the Gospel of John, there is one apostle who stays with Jesus to the very end, the beloved disciple, and it's possible that Wiglaf represents a character a bit like that. So I think the author is in subtle ways letting us know that he is very much familiar with the New Testament. There are also several comments about the afterlife, the idea that there is this sort of life with God after death, which is really at odds with the pagan Anglo-Saxon understanding of what awaits us after death. There's a very clear statement of this on page 15 of this edition, anyway. But think about this for a minute, then, right? So we've got this Christian poet, and I hope I've convinced you that our poet is Christian. And he's writing about characters that are pagan, even though it occasionally sounds like maybe they're sort of monotheistic in some way. But early in the poem, the poet lets us know in no uncertain terms that even people like Hrothgar, these people were pagans. So if you look at pages 13 through 15 in my edition, this would be around line 175, something like that. This is when Herod is being terrorized by Grendel. They can't put a stop to it. And here's what the narrator tells us about what Hrothgar and the other Danes would do. Sometimes at pagan shrines they vowed offerings to idols, swore oaths that the killer of souls might come to their aid and save the people. That was their way, their heathenish hope. Deep in their hearts they remembered hell. But then goes on to say a few lines later, blessed is he who after death can approach the Lord and find friendship in the Father's embrace. So not only is he saying that, yes, they were heathens, they were pagans, but he's also sort of saying there's something sort of pathetically sad about that. He's not judging them so much, criticizing them. They didn't really know any better. But still, it's clear there is a religious chasm between the poet and presumably the poet's audience, immediate audience, and the religious world of the characters in the story. And this is going to create some interesting problems for the poet because he's writing about his ancestors. And I think that one of the main aims of the book is to honor his ancestors, to pay tribute to his ancestors in some way. And I think he clearly presents characters like Hrothgar and Beowulf as characters who are worthy of our admiration. But at the same time, he has to distance himself. He has to put some daylight between himself and these characters and make it clear to his audience that he does not share all of their views and values. And so he's going to do that very clearly on the question of religious allegiance, we might say, polytheism versus monotheism, paganism versus Christianity. But I want to point out at least one other place where this happens, and it is connected to the religious question that I just mentioned. Part of your assignment, in case you missed this week, is to read Seamus Heaney's introduction. You don't have to read he's got a section entitled About This Translation. You don't have to read that. But you do need to read what comes before that, the introduction, Beowulf, the poem, that section. It's there in your syllabus. And one of the things that Seamus Heaney talks about is how for many of the characters in the poem, gold, wealth, treasure is the highest good imaginable in a way that was just sort of obvious in the minds of the characters in the story. But the narrator seems to have a different perspective, precisely because the narrator is a Christian. So when you get to the end of the book, Beowulf is dying and he makes a last request. And his last request is to look upon some of the treasure from this hoard that he has just liberated from the dragon. Okay, so what's the last thing he wants to do with his dying breath? He wants to look at gold. He wants to look at treasure. And when he does this, he gives thanks that I have been allowed to leave my people so well endowed on the day I die. He thinks this treasure is going to be the salvation of his people, the Geatish people. But we know, or we are told in no uncertain terms at the end of the poem, that that is not going to happen. This wealth that Beowulf is gazing on is not, in fact, going to save his people. The cycle of vengeance will continue rolling right along. We're told that the Franks and the Swedes are going to take advantage of the Geat situation. They just lost their great warrior. And towards the end, there's a Geatish messenger who makes a really dire prediction of the suffering and the exile that the Geats have in store. And the poet tells us that the messenger got little wrong in what he told and predicted. In other words, he was basically right about what was going to happen. So we know that Beowulf, the character, he was wrong. This wealth was not going to preserve his people. It was not as powerful as he thought it was. And then you've got to think about what the Geats actually do with the treasure. They bury it in the ground. Okay. And this is kind of an image of futility, right? I mean, what that's what wealth will do for you, not a whole lot. Another little, what I think is a New Testament allusion, comes when the Geats are sort of inspecting the hoard there at the end, and we're told that some of the treasures in the hoard have already begun to rust. And that brings to mind a text like Matthew 6:19, do not store up treasures here on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys. Christians, the audience of the Beowulf poem, they simply cannot look at wealth in the same way that Beowulf did. A very different perspective on the value, the ultimate value of wealth. And if you think about how the whole poem is structured, the poem is, of course, bookended by funerals. There's a funeral at the very beginning that's described, and the funeral of Beowulf at the very end. And think about them for a moment. At the beginning, it's a ship burial. So this great Danish king, Shield Sheafson, is being buried. He's put on a ship, and the ship is loaded with treasure and wealth, and the ship is sent off to sea. And by the way, we know that Anglo-Saxons actually did this. You're going to read about Sutton Hoo, the Sutton Hoo burial ship in Arts Across Time this week, so you'll hear about that. So we start the story, we start the poem with an image of wealth being just sort of sent out into the sea, where of course it's going to benefit no one. The story then ends with wealth being buried in the ground, where of course it's going to benefit no one. And I think what the poem is saying is this is telling us something true about wealth in general. Wealth might bring you certain short-term benefits, but it is not, it cannot save you. It's ultimately futile, and certainly death is stronger than wealth. So this is one place where it seems to me that the Beowulf poet is saying, as much as I admire my ancestors and their way of life, I have to tread another path. But how do you honor your ancestors when you can't follow them, when you can't walk in the same path? Well, for one thing, you can tell their stories. Storytelling and remembering is a form of honoring. And of course, that's exactly what our Beowulf poet is doing. He's honoring his ancestors by telling their stories and by keeping their memory alive. And secondly, you can honor your ancestors even though you have to repudiate some aspects of their way of life. You can honor them by affirming whatever was good and right and true about their beliefs, about their way of life. Certainly, characters like Beowulf and Hrothgar embodied virtues that the poet would wish to commend to his audience: loyalty, courage, and the like. It's also true, I think, that the characters who live in Beowulf's world don't have any illusions about just how quickly life goes by, how powerful death is, how short our time on earth really is. And I think Beowulf, the poet rather, sees a lot of wisdom in that perspective on life. But in the end, the poet is, in a way, saying farewell. Farewell to his ancestors, farewell to their way of life. As Christians, the Beowulf poet and his audience, they can imagine something greater than gold and glory. But Beowulf couldn't. Beowulf couldn't imagine anything greater than gold and glory. And from the perspective of the poet, there's something inescapably sad, maybe even pathetic about that. Um, so I think in a way what's going on here is a kind of valediction. If you think about that opening scene again, where the shield chieftain is honored with this great ship burial, but then they send him off into the ocean and say farewell. I think in a way that's what our poet is doing with respect to the culture of his ancestors, honoring them, um, paying tribute to them, and then in a way saying goodbye. All right.